Hey, I'm Todd.
Hi there, and welcome to Baseball by Design. I am SportsLogos.net Major League Baseball correspondent Paul Caputo, broadcasting live from San Diego, California, Ocean Beach. The ocean is within view right now.
And I am Dan Simon, podcasting from the Studio Simon headquarters at historic Bowman Field in Louisville, Kentucky. And Paul, tell us why today you are Major League Baseball correspondent, Paul Caputo.
Every once in a while, I get to do some really fun things on behalf of SportsLogos.net. And Chris Creamer, who is the founder of that site, has set up for me to have press credentials to the San Diego Padres today, where they are unveiling their new City Connect uniforms. And it just was an absolute stroke of luck that I happened to be here. Chris had been working on the news releases about those new City Connect uniforms, and he had been working directly with the Padres. He reached out to them and said, "Hey, we're gonna have a guy in San Diego. He'd love to come talk to some players about the new uniforms." And so they've got these new Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead themed Katrina Skull City Connect uniforms. And so I'm going to go talk to a few players tonight. That coverage will be on sportslogos.net for anyone who wants to check it out. I've only ever been to one game in San Diego before. That was a decade ago. I'm looking forward to getting back to the ballpark. So I'll do my pregame interviews, and then we're going to go hang out. And they're playing the Rockies. And so we're not exactly Rockies fans, but we're going to wear some Rockies stuff because we live in Colorado and we have some Rockies stuff. Dan, have you ever been to a game in San Diego?
I have indeed. I've been to two games there. The first time I went to a Padres game was in the 90s
Yeah,
sometime at Jack Murphy Stadium, the Murph, as they called it in
yeah.
San Diego. Of course, I was living in Los Angeles. San Diego's 2.5 hours south of LA. So it was a night game, but we weren't going to stay overnight. And lo and behold, the game went into extra innings.
Mm.
I kind of remember it being at least 12 innings. And then they had the post-game fireworks, which you had to wait until like teams all cleared out and everything. And we watched the fireworks and then we drove home. I don't think we got home until like 3 o'clock in the morning.
That is really funny, Dan. This makes me think that like the fireworks must have been going on after midnight, right? Like, I mean, it's the city must have thought it was under attack.
Yes, it was definitely after midnight. And yeah, that's why I was much younger then. With the benefit of hindsight, we should have got a hotel room.
All right, so that was the 4th of July fireworks in the wee hours of the morning, and then you had another signature experience in San Diego. I'm kind of jealous.
This would have been 1998. I was working for the Dodgers and was actually sitting in Los Angeles Dodgers owners' seats.
Oh,
The team was owned by Peter O'Malley and his sister, Terry O'Malley Seidler.
yeah.
And I've already told you I worked with and was friends with Tom Seidler and Kevin O'Malley. I asked Tom if I could get World Series tickets, and he said, "You can have my mom's," because she wasn't going to the game. And they're great seats.
That's awesome.
That was the year that Trevor Hoffman should have won the Cy Young Award. He was just lights out. He had an ERA well under 2. He had 50 some odd saves. He was just unhittable all year. And we went into the 9th inning with the Padres ahead. I don't remember the exact score. He came in, and when he was the closer, his walkout song was Hell's Bells by AC/DC. And I
Yeah.
don't know if you know this, the song starts off with
Yes.
gong,
I remember that. I remember he used to
gong.
come in and that gong would play. Yeah.
Okay, so he comes in, they do that, and the crowd, sold out house.
Yeah.
The stadium was shaking, literally
Yeah.
shaking. The crowd was loud, the loudest I've ever heard in a stadium. Now, probably louder in Citizens Bank Park because of the nut jobs that root for the Phillies. but it was an electric experience. Now, I'm rooting for my Yankees, of course, but it was just a great moment, and I was so happy for my friend. And even if the Yankees lost, it was like it was still it was always going to be a memorable experience for me. Well, it turned out that Yankee third baseman Scott Brocious ended up hitting either a 2 or 3 run homer off of Trevor Hoffman, and the Yankees won that game and ended up sweeping the Padres. So it made it even more memorable for me, but I felt like awful for my friend and all those Padres fans. So that was a very memorable game.
Well, Dan, that's I'm not sure if the Rockies and Padres are going to have. I don't know if we're going to have quite the drama tonight that you've gotten to see in San Diego, but still, I'm excited to be here. And the City Connect program gives lots of opportunities for us to talk about graphic design. As you know, my true love is with minor league baseball. There's a ton of minor league baseball here in Southern California as well. I think the southernmost team that I have seen might be the Lake Elsinore Storm. Have you ever been to a Lake Elsinore Storm game?
I have been to several. I don't know if it's quite many, but several. When I lived in Los Angeles, I would drive down from time to time to Lake Elsinore to see a Storm game. I remember specifically, it was a 99-mile drive. And I even made that drive once all by myself. And the reason it was all by myself, it wasn't supposed to be all by myself. As a matter of fact, it was supposed to be with my friend, and I'll shout out to him. I'm sure he doesn't listen to this podcast. He might not even know it exists. Tom Thornton, who I took with me to that World Series game. And he and I were supposed to go to the Lake Elsinore game. He grew up in Escondido, which is down there in those parts as well. And I went, I stopped by his apartment to pick him up to then drive down to Lake Elsinore. And I, rang the buzzer, no answer, rang the buzzer, no answer. So I waited a little while, got back out of my car, hit the buzzer again, no answer several times. And so I just got in my car and drove down and watched the game by myself. The reason I'm kind of giggling to myself is I later learned at work the reason that he didn't answer the buzzer for his apartment was he was in jail. So I won't go into the details of why he was in jail, but yeah, that was a good excuse for not answering.
That is pretty damn good. All right, that's fun. But Dan, you have one homework assignment between now and next week. You got to tell your good friend Tom Thornton about this podcast.
I will tell him because hopefully he'll listen to the episode. I'll tell him I name drop him in the episode, in addition to the excellent content that the Baseball by Design podcast provides.
Well, speaking of excellent content, Dan,
see what you did there again?
We have one of the all-time greats in this field of sports design. And he has another new book out. He's got a book coming. It's actually not out yet. It's available for pre-order. We're going to talk all about it, the Ballpark and beyond. But our mutual friend, Todd Radom, who is just, we've said it before, he's a good guy. He's a fantastic designer, and he's written some fun books. We're going to go talk to Todd Radom, author of The Ballpark and Beyond. And then afterwards, Dan, you'll be back with a Studio Simon Stumper.
I will indeed. In addition to all the wonderful things about Todd that you just mentioned, he is also one of the best podcast guests, whether it's on the Baseball by Design podcast. He is a weekly contributor during the season to Buster Olney's ESPN Baseball Tonight podcast. I've heard him on other podcasts as well. Always a great listen. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure all of you will enjoy it as well. And then hopefully you'll enjoy the Studio Simon Stumper that I've got in store.
And Dan, we always invite our listeners to send us letters. I would like to issue a special invitation to anyone who is listening to this podcast from prison. Send us a letter at pauljcaputo@gmail.com. If you are in jail right now listening to this podcast, send us a letter and we'll read it on the air. We'll see you for Stumpers, Dan.
I'll see you soon.
All right, everyone, welcome back to Baseball by Design. My very good friend Todd Radom, resident of Philadelphia, wearing a Philadelphia Phillies cap right now. Todd has a new book coming out. I think this is a first for the podcast, Todd. We're going to talk about this new book that you have coming out. First of all, hello, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm excited to talk about the book and always happy to see you, my friend.
You famously have been on the podcast. Every time there's an episode with a round number, I feel like you're on the podcast to help celebrate in some way. You are multi-book author, designer for all sorts of major league professional sports, attendee of so many all-star games and World Series, and every time I turn on social media, you're the invited guest at some fancy pants sporting event. So not exaggerating to say graphic design royalty in the industry of sports design. So it's my honor to have you back on the podcast. It was very much my honor. Let me tell you, Todd, I felt like a big shot when you offered to send
You are
me
a big shot. What do you mean?
when you sent me an advanced copy of the Ballpark and Beyond, your new book that's coming out, available for pre-order now. It will be published on May 26th. Obviously, it is off to the presses and richly, beautifully illustrated, a collection of just amazing stories about baseball. Your particular focus, your area of interest and expertise, of course, is design and baseball. That comes up a lot in this book, but the book is not exclusively about that. Some of it is quirky, interesting stories about the sport, many things that I did not know. So I think I want to start just with a real basic question about what inspired you to sort of extend beyond your area of professional expertise with graphic design and get into, a book that really is the story of baseball, the history of baseball as told through anecdotes dating back to the 1800s.
Well, as I say in the introduction, how can you not be intellectually curious about baseball? I am, and I have been since I was a little kid, long before I was doing what I do for a living. And I actually say in the introduction, which kind of tells the story, that, I've been a fan like many of us since I was a little kid, but I feel like I've always looked at the game through a bit of a different lens, coming from a family of artists. And I've always been intrigued by the game, both on and off the field. And certainly, I wonder about, what did people eat at a ballpark in the 19th century? I'm fascinated by stories of obscure executives, for example, or ballparks that burned to the ground, 100 years ago. And yeah, I say in there, I know and love plenty of numbers people, stat people, saber people, but I'm not a numbers guy. I am intellectually curious about the entirety of the game, and certainly my professional career has built upon all of that. As I say in there, I've had a cocktail with Babe Ruth's daughter. I knew Buck O'Neill, and I'm friends with Josh Gibson's great grandson, and all of this is just kind of an amazing thing. And all of that kind of leads to a baseball life that brings me to the point of having created this illustrated, written, packaged, designed, and the project of a lifetime, Paul.
You mentioned stadiums that burned to the ground. I feel like there's a running theme here about perhaps stadiums that maybe deserved to burn to the ground, whether they did or they didn't. And of course, I have a unique interest in all things Philadelphia because that is where I'm from. That's my sports fandom. The story about the Baker Bowl. Was it the A's or the Phillies who played
The
there?
Phillies.
It was the
Phillies played
Phillies.
there.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It was the Phillies played in the
Yep.
in
On
the
the
Baker
north
Bowl.
side of Philly. Yeah.
It almost sounded like you were describing the Oakland Coliseum, except, from the 1880s to the 1930s. Like it just sounded like a uniquely terrible ballpark.
Well, it was terrible and it was dangerous. The most deadly stadium in the history of Major League Baseball. There were two incidents in which stands collapsed, and I believe the first one killed, I'm just going to throw it out there, a dozen people in, I think, 1903. 1927, the same thing happened, and one person was killed. But I find Baker Bowl fascinating. It is one of, I wouldn't say it was a modern ballpark, but it was put together with wood and bricks, okay, and it looked like a castle. There aren't too many pictures of the exterior that you can find, but the ones that you can find, it just looks like a factory or something. It's kind
Yeah.
of crazy. It's shoehorned into a lot in North Philly, which made for a very small right field. There are a couple of quotes that stand out. I'm going to paraphrase. Red Smith, the great broadcast or writer rather, said something like, "I'm not saying that right field at Baker Bowl is short, but if the second baseman had onions for lunch, the right fielder would know it." And then there was another quote by the late Larry Ritter, who wrote The Glory of Their Times, in which he said something to the effect that the Baker Bowl started life in the 1890s as a mighty battleship, and by the end of its lifespan, it was a leaky garbage scow. So the Phillies tried to get out of the Baker Bowl lease as early as 1911, and it took them until 1938 to finally move. Foul balls, pop-ups were that hit the roof. Boom! A whole bunch of rust came down on people's heads. So yeah, Baker Bowl is fascinating and frightening at the same time.
I mean, the funny thing about this, as I was reading it, because I had an advanced copy like a big shot, and so I'm reading this book and I'm getting ready for this conversation. There are so many stories that I want to, delve into. I'm going to try not to make this a 2-hour episode of Baseball by Design here, but I had some sort of large scale questions too that I wanted to ask. So I will before we touch on some of these really fun and funny stories or interesting, tidbits about the history of baseball. One of the things that you did that I, really thought was interesting for this project was there are no photographs, right? Like it's you did illustrations. If you were representing a human being, if you were representing, a pennant, there are no historical photographs of these things. You recreated them, you illustrated them, which creates a consistency throughout the book, your illustrative style, but also you can see the history of these pieces sort of conveyed through those illustrations. I don't know if this seems like an obvious question to you because you've been working on this for so long. That decision was probably made a long time ago. But what went into the decision to not include photographs of these things that you're talking about, but to, include your illustrations of them instead?
I'm recalling something that the Hall of Fame football coach Bill Parcells said about, when he resigned from the New England Patriots. He said, he wanted to be GM, he wanted to be head coach. He said, I want to make the meal, I want to buy the groceries, I want to set the table, I want to, I'll keep going, invite people over. I want to curate the whole thing. Well, that was the desire for this. I have always had I love to write, I love to design, I love to illustrate. Why not something that is very unique to me? The whole picture, right? Like just all of this. And this seemed like the time to do it, and it seemed like a theme to expand upon that would lend itself to all of these different things.
You held up a bound copy of the book as we were talking here. There it is again. One of the things that I noticed, because I have Winning Ugly sitting over here next to me, my signed copy of Winning Ugly. You and our mutual friend Chris Creamer, you wrote The Fabric of the Game about hockey jerseys, about hockey design. I've got that book over here as well. The book that you were just holding up is noticeably, even through Zoom here, noticeably thicker than those other books. So at a certain point, you had to decide when to stop because I'm sure there are a bajillion stories that are not told in this book. So it's a two-part question. What was your research process? Are these stories that you stumbled on, or did you go find them? And then how did you decide to stop? Like what happened to the stories that didn't make it into the book?
Well, we don't want to make this into a doorstop, Paul. We don't want a multi-volume encyclopedia set. That's not what we're looking for. We want a book that feels good in your hand, that is priced at a point that is paper costs money, binding costs money, shipping costs money. You don't want something too big that's going to be too expensive. The genesis of the book goes back to blogging days.
Mm.
That I would just be curious. Here's the intellectually curious part about a certain story and blog about it. Well, blogging days are long past us. Unfortunately, I kind of miss it. And there came a point that these stories became a regular feature on the ESPN Baseball Tonight podcast with Buster Olney, who wrote the foreword for the book. So I do a segment, as you know, some of our listeners might know, called The Ballpark and Beyond. So this became sort of an expanded, illustrated version of that builds upon kind of, imagine a season of, let's say, 25 to 30 episodes of the Baseball Tonight podcast. And then, imagine expanding the theme of this, not exactly, but the theme of this to 75 small chapters, bite-sized little pieces that flit about throughout the history of the game, right up to contemporary times, but touch on topics both on and off the field. So that's really where it all comes from.
You mentioned Buster Olney writing the foreword. We've talked on this podcast before, you and Buster Olney's friendship, yours and Buster Olney's friendship goes back many, many years, long before either of you were the celebrities who you are now. I was laughing because Buster Olney in the foreword mentions that you created a logo for his fantasy football team. I think it was a football team.
Well, both football and baseball years ago.
Football and baseball. You did something similar for Billy Beane of the then Oakland A's. And then we talked a couple of weeks ago with Tyler Maughan. You created a logo for Tyler Maughan's wedding. So there's a lot of people getting the friends and family discount out there for some serious design work from a serious designer here.
You got to be on the list. You got to be in the behind the velvet ropes like you, Paul. A VIP, as you said.
You mentioned the structure of the book. I want to mention that because I thought it was really fun and let me know what was coming as I was reading it. You broke it down into innings. Of course, there are 9 of those. The history of the game, spanning the globe, which had some funny stories, the distant past, frivolities, franchises, ballparks, on the field, off the field, and the look of the game. So there was, obviously rich veins, and each of those 9 innings is roughly equal. One of the things I noticed, and I'm curious, I have not prompted you with this question, and I will tell you the answer to this question in my mind is not Philadelphia. I noticed that there was a city that had almost like an outsized role, I felt like, for the size of the city and its significance in Major League Baseball's landscape. A city that kept coming up over and over and over again as I was reading it. And I can tell you the name of that city, but I'm curious if you felt, as you were writing, were there cities that you felt like kept coming up in ways that others did not?
Well, I kind of look at it as franchises. First of all, let me move back for a second. I credit my editor, Jason Katzman, with having wrangled these things up and came up with a rationale of how to categorize these disparate little mini chapters into thematic innings. So he gets all the credit in the world for that. But I tried to spread out, I want to represent every city, every franchise to the greatest degree possible. But let's face it, there are not a ton of interesting stories about the Arizona Diamondbacks. They've won a World Series and they've been around for a generation.
Yeah.
But I mean, the St. Louis Cardinals, for example, or the Chicago Cubs have a lot more history and a lot more, stuff both on and off the field that's interesting. And history in particular, and, it requires some perspective in order to perhaps resonate or catch something that you might not otherwise think of. So it's spread out, but there's a lot of Chicago is in here for sure.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking?
Well, Chicago is one of the cities. That's not the one I was thinking of, just because I would sort of expect Chicago to play a significant role. Montreal, I want to do an episode of Baseball by Design on the Montreal Expos because I know you love that logo and you have studied and written about that logo. The city that I'm thinking of didn't have a major league team until 1969. Seattle, I felt like, kept coming up in sort of funny, interesting ways. Major League Baseball goes back to the late 1800s. Seattle didn't have a team till first 1969, and that was only for one season, obviously, with the Seattle Pilots, and then, of course, the Seattle Mariners, 1977, I want to say.
Yep, that's right.
The Pilots were a funny story. Visually, they had the scrambled eggs, right, like on their on their cap,
on the visors,
on the visors. The Mariners, maybe it's because I go, I run a couple times a week with my good friend Chris, and he's a huge Mariners fan, and so we're always talking about Mariners things. But the Mariners were the first team to have a website. The story about how they kept changing and tweaking their logo to try to change their luck as a franchise, which I thought was hilarious. Like, that's the most like baseball superstition thing ever.
Absolutely.
They had a tugboat themed bullpen car, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's hilarious.
Very colorful. No, you're right. Yeah. And this is, of course, listen, they got to within a game of the World Series last year.
Yeah.
And they have never appeared in the World Series yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Seattle punches above its weight in superstardom
Yeah.
with Ken Griffey Jr.,
Yep.
the face of the game at a certain point in the 90s. As you noted, I have a little chapter, and certainly I was well into adulthood for the onset of the internet. The Mariners were the first club with a website, so that's a story there. But yeah, there is quite a bit of Seattle content, starting with the Pilots, because the
Yep.
Pilots one and done season is just kind of a dumpster fire in many ways. And just it's amazing to me that the Pilots are on the cusp of bankruptcy. It's spring training. They are on the cusp of a new season in 1970, and the equipment trucks are kind of stuck in, I think it was Las Vegas, not knowing if they were going to head to the Pacific Northwest or somewhere else. And they wound up going to Milwaukee. And so it's unimaginable to
Yeah.
have a team move with just days' notice in this day and age. So they are fascinating for many reasons.
These stories appeared pretty close to each other in the book, but the lack of preparation that the Pilots had before their 1969 season sounded similar to the Colt 45s, the Houston Colt 45s, who also played in a terrible mosquito-ridden stadium, right? Like, and so,
Yeah.
the Colt 45s survived in a way that the Pilots did not. I mean, I guess the Pilots franchise still exists, but Houston still plays in the same city. But those two 1969 teams, the Colt 45s were 69 as well, right? Do I have that right?
Colt 45s are 62. They came in with the Mets.
They were 62. Okay. Well, it's
But
there's a lot.
1969, you had the Expos, who
Yeah.
were severely undercapitalized
Yeah.
from the outset and didn't have a proper stadium to play in until,
Yeah.
almost the brink of their inaugural season. They've always been undercapitalized. That's why they eventually were, devolved into being owned by Major League Baseball and moved to Washington years later.
Yeah.
The San Diego Padres, who were in a very perilous state for years,
Yeah.
well into the 1970s. They were on the verge of moving to Washington, D.C. in 1974 for baseball card collectors. There's a top set with Washington NL. The Royals were stable right from the outset because they had a very well-heeled ownership group in with Ewing Kaufman, pharmaceutical executive, and they've always been very stable. And then you have the Pilots. So basically, it was a very rushed expansion
Yeah.
in 1969, and there was no solid footing. Now, listen, MLB is going to expand again at some point sooner rather than later. We need to get past a potential labor stoppage next year, but Nashville, perhaps Salt Lake City, get franchises. These franchises will be sold for billions with a B of dollars, of course. And whoever owns these two teams are going to be well vetted and they're well heeled. That was not the case in 19. The Astros, on the other hand, were they had a little bit of runway and they were pretty well capitalized. And when they moved into the Astrodome in 1965, well, that was seen to be a cash cow potentially for them. They just had to survive those past few years. So all this stuff is really interesting.
As we're talking, I have my notes in front of me here, and there's just so many stories that I want to ask about. One of the larger scale things that I noticed, and I know that you have a relationship with Bob Kendrick and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. The Negro Leagues come up throughout the book, as they should, right? A part of baseball's history. This book would be incomplete without this. One of my favorite stories and one of my favorite pages from the book visually is Satchel Paige's Sage Advice. And you mentioned in the book that these were sort of truisms that were collected by journalists. It was never something that Satchel Paige sat down and said, "Let me write out these bits of sage advice for living a long life." One, avoid fried meats, which angry up the blood. Two, if your stomach disputes you, lie down and pacify it with cool thoughts. Three, keep the juices flowing by jangling around gently as you move. Four, go very light on the vices, such as carrying on in society. The social ramble ain't restful. Listen, I have read his autobiography. I'm pretty sure that he did not follow that advice.
No, not at all.
Five, avoid running at all times, which is hilarious. I just, that's an amazing one. Avoid running at all times. And six, don't look back. Something might be gaining on you, which, hard to do if you're not running at all. You created, among the many. I'm a huge fan of typography in design, and there you go. You're holding up the page. I'm looking at the PDF. You're holding it up on screen right now. That page is really beautiful, right? Like that could be a poster. You could pull that out and frame it and put it on your wall. This story, this section of the book, I was really taken by, and the larger picture of your inclusion of Negro Leagues history, scattered throughout the book. Yeah, I really enjoyed that about this book. So I realize this is a long runway for probably 7 different questions. I'll start with your relationship with Bob Kendrick and the Negro Leagues Museum, and what seems to me an intentional decision to include Negro Leagues history in this book. Obviously, that was something intentional that you did.
You cannot tell the story of baseball without the Negro Leagues for multiple reasons. You think about as I know you do, and I certainly do. What would it have been like to attend a Homestead Grays game? No matter who you are, I don't care if you're black, white, it doesn't matter. Like you're
Yeah.
seeing this incredible talent that did not have. They had a big stage. Let's not deny that. But I can remember, as I said earlier, I knew Buck O'Neill, and I remember him showing me around that museum in Kansas City in, I think, 2001. And him, as he publicly said it to me privately, don't weep for us because we traveled in style. These were black-owned businesses. These were, the fans were coming out and seeing amazing things. And, I keep that in my mind. Now, I met Bob Kendrick back in I guess the late 90s when he was the new marketing guy at the Negro Leagues Museum. And obviously the greatest living champion of the leagues, of the Negro Leagues, carries the torch, brings the stories to life, and a wonderful human being, great friend. But yeah, you have to talk about the Monarchs and their innovations too. The Monarchs traveled with a portable lighting system. So they're bringing night baseball all over the United States. Sort of like, it's the story of the Negro Leagues. They are resourceful and, they're not allowed to be major leaguers in that sense. They are major leaguers now. But yeah, they just made things happen. And the Homestead Grays and what they meant to both Pittsburgh and Washington, the great Josh Gibson, the 1931 Homestead Grays with, what is it, 7 future Hall of Famers in there. The stories are unbelievable, and they are integral to the sport of baseball. So you've got to put them in there, and they're entertaining. And listen, Satchel Paige, to your point earlier, one of the game's greatest characters. Certainly, all these apocryphal stories, but the stories about him calling in his outfielders and throwing 3 balls that were pop-ups, or his ability to groove a pitch over a gum wrapper or a cigarette at home plate are legendary. And he pitched in a major league game with the Kansas City Athletics, in 1965. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, his like I said, his biography was incredible, and some of the stories that end up in there. You used the word apocryphal. You used a lot of good words in this book, Todd. There were a couple of times I had to stop and look them up, so I appreciated that.
I want to challenge. I want to challenge the readers.
Interregnum was the one I actually texted you about it. I said,
Yes,
Todd,
you did, and that refers to the Hot Stove League.
Yeah.
And that is it's an in between. It's like a liminal. That's another one.
Yeah.
Period of where we're waiting for spring training, and yeah, so that it's an appropriate word.
I promise I'm going to let you go at some point here, Todd. But there's more. There are more questions that I have. More just sort of fun things I want to talk about. First of all, things that contemporary baseball fans take as a given. Uniform numbers on the back of jerseys. 1929 with the Indians and the Yankees. But before that, there were teams as early as 1916 that tried to wear uniform numbers on the sleeves.
Right.
And so that is a first. I think people have heard that story before about uniform numbers. Certainly the 1929 part. The 1916 part was new to me. But other things that were sort of surprising to me. The World Series trophy. What a trivia question. Who was the first team to win a World Series trophy? the St. Louis Cardinals in 1967. We didn't have a trophy before 1967. Is that
Yeah, and listen, this speaks to the fact that there was a World Series in the 1800s, and it was
yeah,
actually called the World Series.
yeah.
It was the National League and the and the American Association, which was a big league at that time. But anyway, they had a series of trophies. But I say in the book, look at footage of, I don't know, the Yankees of the 40s or 50s winning a World Series. You'll see guys hugging each other, and they weren't high-fiving. They
Yeah.
were slapping backs. At a certain point, booze enters the conversation. They're pouring beer over each other's heads, cans of beer in the clubhouse. Eventually, that becomes champagne, but there's no trophy.
Yeah.
There's no World Series trophy until 1967 in the modern era, when the commissioner of baseball, the short-lived General William Spike Eckert, suggests a trophy, and that becomes the commissioner's trophy, and it's taken on certain forms. But yeah, it's kind of hard to believe because it's such a, listen, we saw the Dodgers win in Toronto in 2025. I say, perhaps the greatest World Series ever, whole nother thing.
Yeah.
But the trophy presentation is a pretty big piece of the puzzle here. Nope, didn't happen until 1967.
It's crazy. I mean, just like it's such a fact of baseball fans' existence right now. Another fact of baseball fans' existence is Major League Baseball's logo. That Major League Baseball had a logo at all, and that it is on the back of baseball caps. That's a relatively new phenomenon in the long history of baseball. The Major League Baseball logo is from 1968, and they didn't start putting it on the back of caps until the 1990s, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so that was these firsts are pretty interesting. The commissioner's signature on the baseball that went away in 1999. That
Well, the league presidents,
sorry, I'm sorry.
the National and American leagues were once very autonomous, rival organizations to some
Yeah.
degree. And the league presidents got their signatures on there. Now it's Commissioner Manfred. I have one sitting about 5 feet to my right over here.
Yeah, that's also the signature on minor league baseball logos as well, because that's a Major League Baseball thing.
I'm looking to my left over here, Paul, and
Yeah,
on top of a short bookcase, I've got a series of, I think, 16 minor league baseballs from about 15 years ago.
yeah,
And you've got the signature of the president of the Appalachian League
right.
or the Pacific Coast League. They're all together in a display. But yeah, it's everything has been consolidated and homogenized. And listen, this is a metaphor for the world right now,
Yeah,
where,
yeah,
a
yeah.
whole nother podcast about that.
You live, I'm not trying to dox you here, but you live in Fishtown, a neighborhood in Philadelphia. Fishtown plays a role in the production of baseballs. AJ Reach's manufacturing plant was in Fishtown in Philadelphia until 1936. I had no idea that Philadelphia played that role in manufacturing actual baseballs.
Yeah, so AJ Reach is not in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but a lot of people feel he should be. He was one of the game's greatest early stars in the 1860s, founded the Philadelphia Phillies in 1883, but he kind of followed the Albert Spalding model, where Albert Spalding was a huge star of the game's greatest pitcher in the earliest days of pro baseball. And he went into the sporting goods business because he was very well connected. He was had the ability to raise capital. AJ Reach followed in his footsteps, secured the license, if you want to call it that, a contract to produce every American League baseball starting in 1901. And he partnered up with a guy named Benjamin Franklin Scheib of Scheib Park fame, a co-owner of the Philadelphia Athletics at first. So anyway, they got the contract to produce the first official balls for the American League. Scheib had patented the figure eight baseball, which is still used, and those baseballs were produced en masse at what are now a series of very nicely appointed lofts in the Fishtown neighborhood of Philly, called appropriately Reach Lofts.
That is appropriate. All right, Todd, I'm going to ask you one more question because, we can't just keep talking forever.
Well, we could keep talking,
We
but we have
could
to
keep talking forever. We're going to do that at the All-Star game in Philadelphia this year instead of here on this podcast. Before I get to my last question, I'm going to rattle off just some notes, just some things that from the book that I absolutely loved. there was an essay called Edwin Jackson, a Teammate for All, which detailed all the teams that Edwin Jackson played for. It read like the that Will Ferrell documentary, Ferrell Takes the Field, where he played for 10 spring training teams in one day. That's what that Edwin Jackson chapter felt like. The Discarded Mascot Hall of Fame felt like you were describing the island of misfit toys,
Yes.
some creepy, terrible old mascots. Elephants on Parade, the story of how the Athletics elephant logo was actually the result of
A
an
diss.
insult.
It was
Yeah,
a diss.
from John McGraw.
1902. Yeah.
You did a whole chapter on the Phillies beating the Cubs 23-22.
Paul, I love that, that game, the 23-22 game in 1979.
Yeah.
I went back and watched it on YouTube, and to kind of, I remember, I'm old enough to remember this game, but I didn't see it. But you can watch the broadcast on
Yeah.
YouTube, and it informed what I wrote, and to see it in quote unquote real time, unbelievable, 23-22.
Phillies won 23-22. They were leading 7-6 after one inning. The last chapter in the book, the last section of the book is the look of the game. You get into the Cincinnati Greens, which is, you get into St. Patrick's Day uniforms, really fun. And then it ends with the Hall of Uniforms, which is, again, beautifully illustrated, a compendium of illustrations of notable uniforms from Major League Baseball. The last question that I have for you, though, and this is culled from many. I had to decide on what the last question was going to be here. One of the chapters that I absolutely loved the most, because you can see behind me here, there's nothing I love more than a tchotchke with a Phillies logo on it, right? Like, and
Yeah.
if something has a Phillies logo on it, I own it. I've got a necktie, I've got sunglasses, I've got a giant oversized necklace. If it says Phillies, I own it in some way. The chapter Caps, Coffins, and Commemorative Coins gets into the fact that these tchotchkes didn't really exist for many years. That's a phenomenon from my lifetime, right? Like, you talk about there were pennants and buttons maybe for 100 years in Major League Baseball. And then, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, that's when we've gotten into the tchotchkes. And you use the word tchotchke. I'm using your word.
It's perfect.
The first tchotchke was a ceramic ashtray shaped like Wrigley Field from a gentleman who went on to become one of the most notable sports licensing tchotchke sellers. The title of that chapter is Caps, Coffins, and Commemorative Coins.
Yes.
There was a coffin. You can get buried in, your team.
Well, that's it. I say, like, if your fandom, if you really want to take your fandom to the extreme, to the afterlife, whatever that may consist of, you can be buried in an official major league coffin, or perhaps an urn if cremation is an option, with logos and the selling copy, which is included in here with all the requisite trademarks and register mark notes and all this stuff. Yeah, that's really, these tchotchkes, as we call them, perhaps take us closer to the field of play. They make us feel connected with community and to team, and they take on different forms, sometimes strange, a la what I just discussed. But also, I think it's just kind of amazing that I think it's something like, you could get a Brooklyn Dodgers USB charger. I'm just imagining Duke Snyder looking at this device like, what the hell is this, right? So it could be preposterous at times, dog collars and all the things. And yeah, it wasn't really a thing until relatively recently.
There was a plan to demolish Fenway Park. They were going to put up a new Fenway. You get into how the Braves ended up in the National League West. There's so much, Todd. There's so much in this book. It's such a fun read. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting about it. And, everyone should be as lucky as I am that they'll get to hang out with you at the All-Star game and get their copy of this book signed. But in the absence of hanging out with Todd in Fishtown, where can people go to get the book?
So it is available wherever books are sold.
Yeah.
I have a portal on my website, toddradom.com, in which I have pre-orders for signed copies, but there are also buttons that you can mash for whatever your bookseller of choice is, be it Amazon, Books A Million, yada, yada, yada. I will also say, Paul, as you know, and we have talked about, I read the audiobook version of this, so it will be available on Audible sometime next month as well. So anywhere books are sold, you can get it, and you can put pre-orders in right now.
It's appropriate that you read the audiobook because as I was reading this, I had your voice in my head. It's very much in your voice.
I
I'll
get to
say
imitate Casey Stengel on there, Paul,
that's pretty.
testifying before the United States Senate. I got to emote. I got to ham it up a little bit.
That chapter had me laughing out loud. Casey Stengel's syntax, impossible to follow syntax in front of, this hearing at the U.S. Congress. That's just so funny. I pre-ordered my copy from a small bookstore in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, the Celia Bookshop, where my sister-in-law Jody works.
Oh.
So you can support small bookstores. You can order this through and like you say, anywhere where you get books.
Bookshop.org is one of the buttons on my site that I link to, and that is small bookshops. And I would hit that first.
There you go. Todd, this has been so much fun. I can't wait to see you in July. Congratulations on the new book. It's genuinely beautiful. It's a fun read. At times poignant, funny. The story about the last game at Ebbets Field was really touching, right? Like that was legitimately sad.
Surprising too, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Their atmosphere of anger at a
Yeah.
certain point.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an emotional roller coaster, this book. Congratulations. It's beautiful. And look forward to chatting more. And I look forward to having you sign my copy in July.
Paul, it is always a pleasure, my friend. I look forward to that as well. Thank you for letting me share the book, and it's always great to see you here.
Deep within the recesses of his secret headquarters, somewhere in Louisville, Kentucky, sits Dan Simon. By day, Dan is the owner of Studio Simon, but by night, he tries to stump one Paul Caputo. This is Studio Simon Stumper.
All right, everyone, welcome back. It is time for Studio Simon Stumpers. Dan, I just can't stop smiling. It's just getting to talk to Todd, having you on every week. What a joy this podcast is for me. This whole world of minor league baseball, the press credentials to the Padres, the fun people I get to meet through this podcast. It's such a joy. And Todd is one of those people who just makes me smile. Such a fun conversation. And I said to Todd a couple of times, I feel like kind of a big shot for getting an advanced copy of his book. Now, I hope everyone will go check it out. May 26th. Go order it, Dan, from a small bookstore near you. In the meantime, Dan, Studio Simon Stumpers, we did not talk about anything. Sometimes you'll reach out to me and say, like, okay, what are you guys going to talk about so I can align a Studio Simon Stumper? There was none of that conversation around this. So so far as I know, you were flying blind here. So I'm curious to see where you landed.
I have landed in the ballpark and beyond. I am familiar with those stories. Now, Todd might have added a few, but it was introduced on the aforementioned Buster Olney's ESPN Baseball Tonight podcast, which I listen to religiously. As a matter of fact, I've listened to it from a church, a temple, and a mosque. So,
but never jail.
Never jail. Hopefully, that's not a place I will be, let alone. Although, if I do land in one, I'm sure I'll be saying many prayers while I'm in there.
Nicely done. Nicely done, Dan.
So, the ballpark and beyond. Our stumper today is going to take us to a ballpark and slightly beyond that ballpark.
Okay.
The ballpark it's going to take us to is Valley Strong Ballpark in Visalia, home of the Rawhide. And our Studio Simon Stumper today asks, which of these can be found just beyond the right field fence at Valley Strong Ballpark in Visalia? Is it a corral, a barn, or a saloon?
Well, we have a forthcoming episode on the Visalia Rawhide, and I have not yet conducted any of the interviews for that episode. So at the moment, I don't know precisely. But given that this is a situation, I've never been to the ballpark, and I don't recall writing about any of those things existing beyond the right field wall of that ballpark. The most fun answer is clearly the saloon. And so I am going to go saloon as the correct answer and the most fun answer to this Studio Simons number.
Before asking you this question, and actually even right up until now, well, no, actually now I do know, I did not know whether or not your Baseball Palooza one of your Baseball Palooza trips had taken you to Visalia and other northern, well, I guess that's more like Central California. Yeah, I don't even know on a map where it is. It's just not Los Angeles and not San Francisco, somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And if you had been there, you would know the answer immediately. If you hadn't been there, you would likely just have to take a wild guess, which is what you did, and swung and missed.
Oh, are you serious? I was pretty confident in that.
Well, yeah, obviously this is a team called the Rawhide, and
Yeah.
and with that name, they have a logo. It's not in their primary logo, but they've got a secondary logo of their mascot, Tipper, which is a cow.
Yeah.
It's technically a bull, but a cow. It's a bovine, let's say.
Okay.
So, this was fun trying to come up with fun for me trying to come up with three options for, okay, if you've got a bovine themed identity, what could possibly be beyond that fence? And the former owners of the team, they built a barn not to house a bovine or bovines plural, but to use as basically their equipment shed, for their field maintenance and whatever else they needed to put in there. And so just beyond I actually think it is not only just beyond it, I think it backs up to the back of the outfield fence, I think. I don't even know if there's a space between the wall and the barn, but there's a big red barn out there.
I was sure it was going to be a saloon. So I'm sad to have gotten it wrong, but it's a fun story, a big red barn at the Visalia Rawhide. And the answer to your question, Dan, we have been to Southern California for a Baseball Palooza, but it was only the original Baseball Palooza prequel that I did with one other guy, my friend Jeremy. We went to the aforementioned Lake Elsinore Storm. That was the very first game on the very first Baseball Palooza with just us two guys. And then we went to the Bakersfield Blaze. Rest in peace, Bakersfield Blaze. And then we went to the Inland Empire 66ers and rounded it out with the Rancho Cucamonga Quakes. So that was our only Baseball Palooza in California. So anyhow, Dan, this was a fun one. Thank you as always. And thank you for this emergency recording, which we implemented because I rearranged the schedule for the podcast. And so I wasn't expecting to be broadcasting from San Diego, but you were available for an emergency stumper recording, a rare occasion where we just do one stumper while we're sitting here together. So normally we do these in batches. We've revealed how that sausage was made on a previous episode. So now I can say that this was a rare one stumper recording session. And so I can say this literally, we will see you next week.
We will literally. We already have that scheduled, and I will see you, and our listeners will hear us again next week.